When a tragedy happens, one of those sudden, shocking acts of violence that just rips through everyday life, the news, it doesn't just give you information. It often feels like it's just delivering this overwhelming, unfiltered noise. We're talking, of course, about the recent devastating incident involving Zhang Wen and Taipei. And it's a case that really, it just perfectly shows how media tends to react not just there, but globally when a system fails.
It's so true. In those first few hours, right after it happens, everyone's looking for answers,
Yeah.
and the sheer volume of raw detail can feel, well, paralyzing. Our sources for this week, and they're a pretty comprehensive analysis of media consumption and psychological impact research, they really force us to confront a fundamental question. And this question sort of frames our entire deep dive for you today. The issue isn't really whether we talk about perpetrators or the mechanics of what they did, it's how we talk about them. And just as important, what we choose to focus on.
Yeah. Exactly. When the public conversation is just saturated with coverage, usually within the first 48 hours, the vast majority of it, it's just low-value stuff. We all need a way to navigate that flood. So our mission today is to help you, the listener, move beyond that voyeuristic consumption, the kind that just leaves you feeling anxious and honestly less informed than when you started. We want to get to a place of responsible, high-quality analysis.
And we want to be very clear about what we mean by that, what reporting actually promotes understanding, accountability, and crucially, prevention, versus what's just exploiting a tragedy for clicks or for ratings. You see, our sources, they immediately bring up this core conflict that journalists and all of us as consumers really struggle with. It's the fear that if you analyze a perpetrator's psychology or their background, you might encourage imitation.
And that fear is completely understandable. The idea that analysis could accidentally become endorsement. But it misses this really critical distinction that we're going to build our deep dives on today. If we just ignore the causes, the how and the why behind violence, we're basically refusing to learn. We're refusing to learn the very lessons we need for prevention.
Right. The key clarification from the sources is that this debate isn't a binary. It's not talk versus silence. It's all about the quality and the intention of the conversation. The real difference is between responsible analysis and voyeuristic consumption. One seeks systemic truth, the other just seeks spectacle. If we analyze it poorly, yes, we risk doing harm. But if we refuse to analyze it at all, we guarantee future failure.
So, okay, let's unpack that. That's a crucial tightrope to walk. We need to be able to spot the difference and spot it immediately between journalism is trying to find solutions and the media's almost reflexive hunger for a spectacle.
To start, let's define what that voyeuristic consumption actually looks like in practice. The sources, they detail these common, predictable patterns of coverage that, frankly, turn human tragedy into what they call a serialized drama.
A serialized drama. That's a powerful way to put it.
It is. This continuous sensationalized coverage, it risks what we call secondary trauma, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail later on. But the main problem, right out of the gate, is that this content, it just doesn't inform. It creates volume, but there's no substance.
You see these patterns pop up almost immediately, don't you?
Yeah.
After any major incident. They're sort of the journalistic equivalent of, I don't know, junk food. Easy to produce, satisfies that immediate curiosity, but ultimately, there's no nutritional value. And the sources highlight 4 really consistent features of this sensationalism, especially after the Taipei incident.
And these features, they're depressingly easy to spot once you know what you're looking for. They all share one characteristic. They prioritize anecdote and drama over structure and system.
Right. Okay, so feature number 1, what the sources call the neighbor genre. This is that flood of interviews with people who live next door, down the hall. You always hear quotes like, he was usually very quiet, or the complete opposite, sometimes he would shout late at night. It's all anecdotes designed to build some kind of narrative, right?
Yeah.
Either he was a ticking time bomb no one saw, or he was a misunderstood eccentric.
And the journalistic value of that, it's effectively zero. At best, it's an irrelevant detail. At worst, it's completely misleading. It generates this caricature instead of a real profile. It literally substitutes genuine behavioral analysis with, well, community gossip.
Okay, so that's number 1. Feature number 2 is this obsession with personal space, a kind of physical voyeurism. After the Zhang Wen incident, we saw so much coverage focused on what his rented apartment looked like. There were detailed visuals, and I found this incredible direct shots of his doorway, the hallway.
Pure spectacle. That's all it is. It treats the location like some kind of grim tourist attraction, not a crime scene to be professionally analyzed for actual clues, like how materials were stored or evidence of planning. The audience gains nothing from that. Nothing but a momentary, uncomfortable peek into a private space.
And feature number 3. This is the attempt to inflate the incident into some kind of story of, like, strategic genius. The sources point out how the media just relentlessly pursued this minute-by-minute reconstruction of Zhang Wen's route and his preparations. They use these dramatic phrases like cloud-based planning or a master strategy.
The intention there is so obvious, isn't it? It's just to heighten the drama. But if you actually think about it soberly, any complex action requires planning. That's not remarkable. It's just a logistical reality. But framing it as genius romanticizes the act and the perpetrator. It creates this dangerous myth of complexity and control that just isn't helpful.
And then finally, feature number 4. The preoccupation with technical specifics. This was so clear in the detailed descriptions of his equipment, how many smoke devices he had, what materials he used, and crucially, how they were made.
And this is the feature that crosses the line from just irresponsible reporting into actively dangerous reporting. We're going to dedicate a lot of time to this later when we talk about the copycat effect. But if you take all 4 together, the gossip, the voyeurism, the manufactured drama, and the technical specs, they just dominate the airwaves right after something happens.
So we have to stop and ask that difficult fundamental question. How does any of the superficial coverage help us understand what happened or prevent the next one? And the obvious answer is, it doesn't.
It simply does not, and that is the core analysis in our sources. The only function of this type of content is to satisfy a base curiosity, that urge to see inside the apartment, to know exactly when he left, and above all else, to generate clicks and ratings to fuel that 24-hour news machine. Which brings us to this really crucial overarching distinction between the why and the how.
Okay, let's define that difference again, but maybe with a bit more detail, because it really does separate valuable, protective reporting from just exploitation.
Right. So, valuable analysis asks why. Why did this person act? Why did the system fail to stop them? Why did the environment or the infrastructure allow the attack to be successful? Asking why it's an inherently proactive investigative process. It seeks causes and solutions. It requires real expertise in psychology, sociology, policy.
Whereas irresponsible reporting focuses almost obsessively on how it happened. It's just recounting the minute-by-minute sequence of events, the logistics, the choreography of the violence itself. It details the tools, the route, the exact moment the perpetrator walked into that public space.
And recounting the how just gratifies this dark, temporary curiosity. It serves only as consumption. It lets the audience consume the drama without having to engage in the intellectual challenge of prevention. And that distinction, it's just immediately lost when journalistic decisions are driven purely by metrics.
You just hit on something so critical there, the economics of it all, the economics of sensationalism. If a news organization knows, just by looking at their analytics dashboard, that a picture of a suspect's doorway or some exclusive grainy clip of the chaos that generates 10 times the revenue of a sober report on, say, veteran mental health counseling protocols, well, the content choice becomes automatic. And it's dangerous.
It's an economic trap, and it ensures that the news cycle strips all structural context from the incident. It reduces a complex systemic failure, one involving breakdowns in veteran support, law enforcement tracking, community oversight. It reduces all of that to the actions of one strange, isolated individual.
It's the difference between looking at a fever and just declaring that the patient is hot. Instead of running the diagnostic tests, you need to find the root infection.
Precisely. And the failure is compounded because by focusing on the spectacle, the media actively creates 2 huge public harms. First, it risks triggering imitation, and second, it inflicts psychological damage on the very audience it's supposed to be serving.
Okay, so we've established that when coverage prioritizes spectacle over substance, the harm is twofold. Let's start with the most ethically fraught part of this, the imitation risk, what researchers call the copycat effect. Decades of research have summarized exactly what makes reporting likely to trigger this effect among vulnerable individuals.
When we talk about the copycat effect, we're talking about media coverage that acts as a reinforcement or even a stimulus for someone who's already thinking about violence. Our sources identify 4 distinct features that can turn responsible reporting into an irresponsible catalyst.
All right, this is where it gets really interesting because these features are just abused all the time in the chase for ratings. Let's dive deep into the first one, the tutorial trap.
The first, and maybe the most immediately dangerous feature, is excessive technical detail. This is where the media gives you specifics on how a device was built, reconstructs the logistics, or details preparations way beyond what's necessary to just establish the basic facts. For instance, in the Zhang Wen case, just reporting that he used smoke devices is a verified fact. That's fine. but detailing how they were assembled, the specific materials he bought, the exact timeline of his movements, and the specific weak points in the transit system that he exploited. That's a tactical walkthrough.
That distinction is so important. So if a reporter knows how an act was committed because they talked to the police or saw forensic reports, how do they convey the verified facts without basically providing a blueprint?
They focus on the results and the systemic failure, not the process. For example, a responsible report would say something like, the perpetrator utilized improvised smoke devices, which highlights a need for better monitoring of hazardous materials in residential areas. An irresponsible report says, the devices were constructed using X chemical, which you can get at Y type of store, and he prepared them over Z days, which allowed him to bypass screening.
The sources call this a tutorial, or a mode d'emploi how-to guide. So when journalism crosses that line from documenting a crime to providing a tactical walkthrough, it stops being objective reporting and starts, potentially, enabling the next crime. That's a huge ethical responsibility.
It is, and the media's defense is often just, we're merely reporting the facts. But the level of detail matters profoundly in terms of public safety. This kind of detail serves no informational purpose for prevention. It only serves that voyeuristic curiosity, and dangerously, it can act as a resource for potential imitators.
Okay, moving to the second feature, which is more about narrative construction, romanticizing or mythologizing the perpetrator.
This is all about making the story compelling, often at the expense of reality. The media might reduce a very complex act of violence, one that's rooted in deep psychological and structural failures, to a simplified, almost cinematic narrative. You know the tropes. The lonely avenger, the misunderstood genius fighting the system, or the person driven to madness by some easy-to-digest grievance like social exclusion.
And that kind of narrative invites a really dangerous form of identification, doesn't it? Especially for vulnerable people who already feel alienated or marginalized. If the media portrays the perpetrator as someone who, through this extreme act, finally gets attention or notoriety, it reinforces this twisted idea that violence is a way to become visible.
Exactly. And this romanticizing narrative completely obscures the necessary, difficult look at systemic failures. It's so much easier for the news industry and for us, the public, to consume a tragic movie script than a comprehensive review of, say, deficiencies in government service provision. If the perpetrator is just some tragic, isolated figure, then society doesn't have to look at its own failings in social services, mental health systems, or law enforcement.
The third feature is purely visual, repetitive broadcasting of violent footage. Looping the same images of the attack, the panic, the injury, the chaos, just around the clock.
The source material is unequivocal on this. Repetition does not inform the public. If you saw the smoke-filled platform once, you understood the environment. Seeing it for the 10th time on a continuous loop doesn't deepen your factual understanding at all. What it does do is it conditions audiences to associate extreme violence with immediate visibility, intense attention, and notoriety.
It creates that dangerous feedback loop. Violence equals maximum visibility, and maximum visibility is the prize for the perpetrator.
The fourth and final feature of this kind of exploitative reporting is using sensational labels without structural context. This is where journalists just describe someone with simple, sensational terms like strange, reclusive, or unhinged without dedicating equal airtime or analytical depth to looking at the institutional breakdowns that were also at play.
That sounds almost harmless, just using descriptive labels, but why is that so damaging to prevention efforts?
Because it simplifies a highly complex issue into just individual pathology, and that fosters public anxiety, not understanding. It allows policymakers and society to just shrug and say, oh, that was just a crazy person, and that makes it easier to ignore the structural roots of the violence. The failed tracking system, the lack of veteran support, the ease of getting materials. It gives us a ready-made scapegoat, and it short-circuits the demand for systemic accountability.
And if you tuned into the coverage after the Taipei incident, you saw the most visible part of all this. The endless replays of trauma. We saw the smoke-filled platforms, people running in panic, the moment Mr. Yu collapsed, the frantic arrival of ambulances, often shown again and again, sometimes slowed down for maximum effect.
And this wasn't just shown once for verification. It was broadcast repeatedly, often with this dramatic commentary layered on top. We have to be brutally honest about what purpose that serves. It increases ratings, it fuels social media engagement, it generates advertising revenue, it does not reduce the chance of it happening again, and it does not deepen public understanding of the policy failures that allowed Zhang Wen to move freely for 5 months.
And the psychological cost of this practice, as the sources reveal, is profound. This is where we need to dive into that concept you mentioned earlier, secondary trauma.
Secondary trauma, sometimes it's called vicarious trauma, is the damage caused by relentless, graphic, context-free exposure to this material. It's not just feeling sad or empathetic. It is experiencing genuine, measurable trauma symptoms, anxiety, intrusive images, hypervigilance, and it's derived purely from consuming media, not from being physically near the event.
And the sources provide that incredibly powerful, almost counterintuitive piece of data here.
They do. A major longitudinal study that was done after the Boston Marathon bombing yielded this chilling result that should fundamentally change how we consume news. It found that individuals who consumed more than 6 hours of news coverage related to the bombing, and that's 6 hours in total, across the entire aftermath, they exhibited more severe trauma symptoms than people who were physically present at the scene but intentionally limited their media exposure afterward.
Wait, let's just sit with that for a second.
Mhm.
The idea that consuming media can be more damaging to your psychological health than actually being there during a terrorist bombing, as long as the victim or witness consciously limited their media intake after. I mean, that's completely counterintuitive. How does the source material explain the cognitive mechanism behind that?
The sources explain it like this. Direct exposure, while terrifying, is a finite event. It happens, it ends. You process what you saw, and eventually your brain works to contextualize and file away that memory. However, constant repetitive media exposure, especially of graphic images, keeps the brain in a state of chronic alarm. You are constantly re-traumatizing yourself.
It's the difference between a one-time shock and this.
All right.
Persistent, low-level psychological warfare you're waging on yourself.
Precisely. And what's more, media coverage often presents the violence completely context-free, just a horrifying snippet repeated infinitely. This leads to what's called intrusive rumination. You're constantly exposed to the image without the surrounding facts, without the resolution or the preventative actions being taken. That lack of control and the inability to escape the imagery, it just fuels anxiety, sleep disturbance, hypervigilance. The brain is constantly on high alert, thinking if this can happen there, it can happen here.
This just flips conventional wisdom on its head. It shows that the media's relentless pursuit of spectacle, driven by ratings, and the need to fill a 24-hour news cycle is actively harming the public's mental health. The distance of the event doesn't protect us if we overdose on the graphic imagery. We are essentially self-inflicting secondary trauma through our own consumption.
The conclusion is inescapable. If the reporting provides context-free sensationalism, its greatest harm isn't just the risk of copycats. It's the guarantee of widespread psychological injury to the public that's consuming it.
We've seen the damage irresponsible reporting causes. So now, if we accept this responsibility of analysis, what does genuine structural preventative analysis actually look like? Let's pivot from what not to do to what must be done.
Okay, first, we need to thoroughly deconstruct the content that offers zero value, like that ubiquitous neighbor genre. The neighbor saying he was quiet, the breakfast shop owner who says he bought soy milk, the classmate recalling he had few friends. We have to understand why this information is a red herring.
I sometimes wonder, though, isn't some immediate human context unavoidable? Doesn't the public deserve some sense of who this person was, even if the information is initially superficial?
It's a fair question, and it really speaks to how hard real-time reporting is. Initial context is one thing, but sustained saturation coverage that focuses only on these anecdotes is another. The problem with making quiet or socially withdrawn the key takeaway is the conclusion it implicitly forces on the audience.
Yeah.
That these are the definitive warning signs.
Which means?
It means that if that's the only profile we get, then, as our source points out, millions of quiet, withdrawn, or eccentric people suddenly become suspects. This kind of reporting contributes nothing beyond stigma, anxiety, and fear. It makes it harder to identify actual high-risk indicators because we're all fixated on harmless, common personality traits. It's an information void that just fills airtime but leaves the viewer both less informed and more generally suspicious of their neighbors.
So we need to contrast this superficial stuff with questions that genuinely point toward prevention and institutional failures. And these high-value questions are inherently harder to answer, aren't they? They require real investigative rigor, specialized expertise, and often a willingness to challenge authority.
Precisely. They move beyond the simple narrative of an evil individual to the complex reality of a vulnerable system.
So what are those high-value questions? The ones that truly seek causes and solutions rather than just gossip?
The first question that should drive investigative reporting is this. Why would a person with military training resort to such extreme actions? This question immediately shifts the focus away from the individual's inherent criminality and towards structural failures in state support.
That reframes the entire narrative from bad apple to broken barrel, as you put it earlier. What specific structural failures does that question force us to investigate in the Zhang Wen case?
Well, it compels an investigation into deficiencies in veteran counseling services, post-discharge screening, and the flaws in the wanted person tracking system. Zhang Wen was trained by the state. The state has an obligation to monitor and support that person during their transition, especially if they're deemed high risk or show signs of distress. It forces us to ask, what psychological evaluations were done when he was discharged in 2022? Were there any red flags that were just ignored because of bureaucratic inertia? That's a deep policy dive, a world away from asking a neighbor what color his curtains were.
The second valuable question. It delves into the pathology of the act itself, but it does so responsibly. What psychological mechanisms underlie highly premeditated attacks?
This requires specialized input, moving beyond just labeling someone mad or strange. By focusing on highly planned, premeditated violence, we look for common pathways, the planning stages, the accumulation of materials, a sudden break in employment or social contact. This analysis focuses on the progression to violence, not just the ultimate result.
So instead of focusing on the individual's strangeness, we're looking at the process of violence.
Yes, and this helps us identify genuine, quantifiable early warning signs. Things like meticulous list making, unusual research into specific materials or locations, or acquiring specialized components long before the person ever executes the plan. The focus shifts entirely to the pathway to violence, which is the only place where society can truly intervene with psychological or law enforcement resources.
And the third question is the broadest one, the one that encompasses the societal context. How does society produce and fail to intercept potential attackers?
This is the holistic question. It points directly toward prevention that includes mental health resource accessibility, social alienation in huge cities like Taipei, economic disparity, and the effectiveness of community monitoring systems. It demands answers not just from the police, but from city planners, social workers, and policymakers. It demands an honest accounting of how easy it is for a citizen to become invisible and disaffected within a large urban environment.
Okay, so let's move from these broader investigative mandates to the three specific critical institutional questions that relate to the Zhang Wen case, the ones that, according to our sources, were so often ignored in favor of all that sensationalism. These are the answers the public really needed.
Let's start with the most obvious operational failure, law enforcement and tracking systems. The question that demands a rigorous investigation is, why was a wanted individual able to move freely in a major city like Taipei for 5 months?
5 months. That is an astonishing amount of time for someone with a warrant out for their arrest to operate without being detected in a modern, highly surveilled capital city.
It is a critical operational failure, and the logistics of the attack pale in comparison to the logistical failure of the wanted person system. Investigative reporters should have been demanding detailed answers on the signalment procedures. What specific data fields were missing? Was his known address not flagged properly? Did bureaucratic silos prevent different agencies, say the military, local police, and national tracking services, from sharing vital information? This is the kind of boring, policy-focused investigation that actually saves lives, but which gets ignored for the sensationalism of filming a crime scene.
The second key institutional question relates directly back to his background and the failures of the state to manage the transition of his former personnel.
We have to ask, why was there no post-discharge monitoring system for high-risk veterans who were released in 2022? Military service often involves unique psychological stressors. If an individual has a history of mental health issues or high-risk training, the state bears some ongoing responsibility for their transition back to civilian life. The absence of a monitoring mechanism isn't just a random occurrence. It's a systemic vulnerability that results from budget cuts, policy neglect, or institutional indifference.
So a reporter looking for real answers here wouldn't be interviewing neighbors. They'd be filing Freedom of Information requests to the Ministry of Defense about social worker allocation per discharged veteran, the duration of mandatory follow-up visits, the criteria for high-risk flags.
Exactly. They would be comparing the stated policy goals with the actual implementation budget and staffing levels. That is the necessary depth of investigative journalism that sensationalism actively seeks to avoid.
And the third question, it concerns materials and environment, addressing the preparation phase of the attack.
How could hazardous materials remain undiscovered in a rented apartment for an extended period? This points directly to failures in regulatory oversight concerning volatile or dangerous chemicals in densely populated residential areas. It also speaks to landlord responsibility and community vigilance. Did the local community health officials have protocols for inspecting unusual odors or the accumulation of strange supplies? What is the landlord's liability for not performing due diligence?
These materials didn't just appear. They were accumulated, stored, and prepared. If there were failures in community monitoring or residential safety checks, that is a solvable problem that has absolutely nothing to do with the perpetrator's supposed reclusiveness.
It's clear that answering these three questions about systemic failure, the law enforcement failure, the Veterans Affairs failure, and the residential oversight failure, is the only path toward genuine long-term prevention. Superficial coverage just ensures these questions remain unasked and the policy gaps remain unaddressed until the next tragedy.
We need to equip our listener, the discerning learner, with practical tools to fight back against this tidal wave of sensationalism. Since their goal is to gain knowledge quickly and thoroughly without being overwhelmed, we need a standard for discerning valuable information from just noise.
We can't expect everyone to become an investigative journalist overnight, but we can teach them to be an active, critical consumer. The sources propose a practical three-question standard for evaluating news content in real time. This allows you, the listener, to practice discernment actively while you're consuming the news.
Okay, question 1 is the foundation of responsibility. Does this report provide context? Context is the crucial distinction between mere description and genuine explanation.
Let's use our sources examples here to illustrate that divide really clearly. The responsible example gives you specific, actionable context. Zhang Wen was discharged in 2022, but no follow-up mechanism existed for high-risk veterans. That clearly explains a policy gap and suggests a path for corrective action.
The irresponsible example, on the other hand, is just pure toxic labeling. Zhang Wen was a soldier. Neighbors said he was strange. One statement provides a mechanism for a structural review. The other just links two unrelated traits, a military background and perceived strangeness, to generate stigma, fear, and a shallow narrative.
Question 2. Is the focus on understanding or on sentimentality and emotion? This separates the analytical from the purely exploitative. You have to identify the report's underlying goal.
A responsible focus is on functional knowledge, how to solve the problem. Something like expert analysis, preventing highly planned attacks by identifying behavioral markers. This implies you're going to look for actionable patterns and apply specialized knowledge to future security challenges.
Whereas the exploitative focus is pure drama and emotional engagement, exclusive reconstruction of Zhang Wen's final 24 hours. So it offers you nothing except emotional drain and voyeurism. If the goal seems to be to make you feel shocked or horrified, it's likely exploitative. If the goal is to explain a pattern of failure, it's responsible.
And question 3 is the simplest but often the most necessary for our own mental health. Does it repeatedly display violent imagery?
If the core function of the content, the main draw, is that endless loop of shocking graphic visuals, the source advises just turning it off immediately. Once is enough for verification of the event. Repetition is simply exploitation and self-inflicted trauma. This simple filter connects right back to that data point from the Boston study. Limiting your visual dosage is paramount to protecting your psychological health.
That 3-question standard is an incredibly effective filter for deciding where you should place your most valuable resource, your attention. Now let's provide a clear, actionable list for the listener based on what our sources suggest we should actively avoid and what we should actively seek out.
When you are scrolling through your feeds or watching news coverage after a tragedy, you have to actively avoid certain formats and labels. They are reliable indicators of low-value content.
Start with the red flags in the headlines. Avoid anything labeled exclusive footage, shocking images, grim scenes, or raw video. This is just marketing for trauma consumption.
Also, rigorously avoid that personalized anecdotal non-information we talked about. Neighbor revelations and classmate confessions or family history secrets. This is gossip masquerading as insight. It's designed to distract you from the institutional failure.
And avoid the attempt to create a dramatic procedural that risks becoming a blueprint. Things like complete reconstructions or detailed roadmaps of the attack sequence. If the reporting feels like a step-by-step guide, it's falling into that dangerous tutorial category.
And finally, always, always avoid programs or channels that replay violent scenes endlessly, especially if the commentator encourages you to watch the moment it happened again. If the graphic images are central to the content, you are actively consuming trauma, not information.
Conversely, let's focus on what the listener who's seeking depth and understanding should actively seek out. Where can they find real value?
You should seek out basic, verified facts and make sure they're clearly delineated from speculation or conjecture. Look for official institutional reviews reports from governmental, security, or social service bodies that analyze their own failures and propose concrete changes.
And we should prioritize professional, expert analysis.
Absolutely. Seek out professional psychological analysis, but remember the caveat. The analysis must be focused on prevention, the interception mechanisms, the pathways to violence, not on the individual's pathology for a sensational purpose. Look for discussions on policy reform, not personality profiles.
And finally, responsible attention should be given to the community and the victims.
Seek out stories of the victims, the efforts to rebuild, and the accounts of those who acted courageously to help others. These are the lives and the actions worth remembering and honoring, rather than elevating the name and image of the person who inflicted the violence. Responsible attention focuses on the healing and the future, not the shock and the past. The premise of this entire deep dive is that responsible consumption of tragedy, when it involves looking at structural failures, is intellectually demanding and it's emotionally taxing. So we have to provide a clear mental health checklist. We're advising discernment, not total disconnection, but even responsible consumption requires limits.
The primary goal has to be managing your exposure dosage. The first concrete step is to limit your total news exposure about the event to a set time, say 15 to 30 minutes a day.
That time limit is crucial. Anything beyond that risks diminishing returns in how much information you're gaining, while significantly increasing the risk of secondary trauma, just like that Boston study so chillingly demonstrated. You are not gaining valuable context by watching the same loop for the 7th time. You are simply increasing your own psychological burden.
And furthermore, whenever you can, prefer text-based reporting over images or video. Text engages your intellectual analytical function. It allows you to process the facts contextually. Repeated graphic images, however, they bypass the intellect and they engage the limbic system, that primitive fight-or-flight response, which is what fuels anxiety, intrusive thoughts, and hypervigilance.
And you have to constantly monitor your own emotional state. Be aware of the signs of secondary trauma: persistent anxiety, recurring intrusive images, difficulty sleeping, or the sudden onset of avoidance behaviors like actively avoiding public transit, for instance, or avoiding crowded places. If you experience these symptoms consistently, you must step away from the media and seek professional help. The source mentions resources like the 1925 hotline in Taiwan as an example. Find the equivalent service where you are and use it. Recognizing the symptoms is the first step to mitigating the effects.
And we absolutely have a communal responsibility to protect those around us, especially children who just lack the cognitive defenses that adults possess.
You must strictly avoid exposing children to violent or disturbing images. They lack the cognitive frameworks to process the context of systemic failure and policy gaps. When you discuss these events with children, if you have to, use age-appropriate language that emphasizes safety, security, and reassurance. The conversation should focus on the actions of the helpers, the swiftness of the response, and the safety measures that are in place, not the details of the harm that was inflicted.
Finally, we have to return to that initial reader concern that launched this deep dive, the fear that analysis equals justification. There has to be a final, unequivocal clarification on this point, because responsible journalism cannot afford to be silenced by this accusation.
It is the highest form of journalistic and intellectual integrity to analyze tragedy. And that analysis must be protected from the accusation that understanding the causes is somehow justifying the violence. If we cannot analyze the mechanisms, we cannot prevent recurrence.
So let's be crystal clear, based on the rigorous standards that are laid out in our sources.
Analyzing the psychological mechanisms and policy failures is not consumption, it is investigation. We're seeking the truth behind the action and the systemic negligence that enabled it. We're looking for mechanisms of interception. Understanding causes is not justifying violence. We can acknowledge the structural conditions, the policy gaps, the social alienation that contributed to the act without in any way mitigating the moral, legal, and criminal responsibility of the perpetrator. And crucially, exposing systemic failures is not exoneration. Holding the system accountable for its shortcomings is a separate, vital process from holding the individual accountable for their crime.
The ultimate goal is never shock, gossip, and spectacle.
The goal must always be understanding, accountability, and prevention. What society needs, what you need as a critical learner, is comprehensive understanding, not exploitation of the event.
This deep dive has challenged us to be more critical about where we place our attention, especially when information is so highly charged. The main lesson is clear. The quality of our attention defines the quality of our understanding. Our attention is a valuable, finite resource, and it should not be wasted on content that offers nothing in return but anxiety and cheap sensationalism.
The next time you encounter coverage of a tragedy, we really encourage you to use that three-question framework we developed today. Don't just passively consume the content that's being delivered to you. Actively evaluate its intention and its informational value.
Ask yourself, is this report providing systemic context? Is the focus on functional understanding or just pure emotion? And most importantly, is it relying on repeated graphic visual imagery to hold my attention?
And if you can't answer those questions favorably, then ask the final provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today. Which goal does this specific piece of reporting truly serve the network's rating or society's immediate vital need for accountability and prevention? The choice you make about where to place your attention is the only way we can force the conversation to shift permanently from shock and spectacle to substance and solutions.